Have you ever had that strange moment when you pause in the middle of your routine and ask yourself, what am I even doing with my life? Maybe it happened at work, during a late-night walk, or when you were scrolling endlessly on your phone. Suddenly, everything felt meaningless. The career you once worked so hard for feels like a cage. The relationships you thought defined you now feel shallow. The hobbies that once brought joy feel dull. This is not depression, though it can feel similar. It's not mere sadness either. What you are experiencing is an existential crisis, a collision between your life, as it has been, and the deeper questions of who you really are. Most people fear this crisis. They think it signals the end of stability or happiness. But in truth, this discomfort is the beginning of something profound. An existential crisis is like a storm that breaks down your false shelters, forcing you to build a stronger, truer home. It is the very place where freedom is born. What is an existential crisis? An existential crisis occurs when you start questioning the very foundations of your life. Who am I, really? What is the purpose of all this? Am I truly free? Or am I trapped in roles society assigned me? If life has no fixed meaning, then what do I do with my time here? The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard was one of the first to describe this condition. He called it the sickness unto death, not a physical death, but the inner death of living without authenticity. Later, philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus expanded on it, insisting that such crises are not weaknesses, but invitations to live with honesty. Why it feels like the world is collapsing if you're in an existential crisis. You know it feels like the ground is slipping from under your feet. Why? Because all the things you once leaned on for stability, your job, relationships, cultural values suddenly lose their certainty. Career disillusionment. You realize the job title you chased for years doesn't make you happy. Relationship doubts. You start asking whether your friendships or romantic life are genuine or just habits. Material confusion. The possessions you worked for bring no deep fulfillment. Mortality awareness. You become aware that life is short, fragile, and unpredictable. This sudden clarity is painful because it tears apart illusions. But illusions have to die if freedom is to be born. Real-life example. Sarah's awakening. Sarah, a 35-year-old marketing executive, seemed to have everything figured out. She had a stable income, a loving partner, and a beautiful apartment. But every morning on her commute, she felt an unshakable emptiness. One day, while staring out of the train window, the thought hit her, I am living someone else's dream. None of this is truly mine. The next weeks were full of anxiety. She felt like she was betraying her family's expectations by even entertaining the thought of leaving her job. Friends told her she was overthinking. But deep down, she knew this crisis wasn't a breakdown. It was her soul refusing to stay asleep. Sarah's story illustrates the core truth. An existential crisis is not the end of life's story. It's the beginning of authentic freedom. Why an existential crisis is a hidden gift at first glance. The crisis feels destructive, but destruction can be creative. Think of a forest fire. It burns, but it also clears the way for fresh growth. Similarly, an existential crisis clears away the false, the shallow, and the borrowed so that the real, the authentic, and the chosen can emerge. Here's why it's secretly a gift. It forces you to wake up. No more autopilot living. It demands honesty. You can no longer lie to yourself about what makes you happy. It breaks borrowed identities. You stop being who society says you should be and start asking who you really are. It opens the door to choice. Once illusions fall apart, you are free to create. The role of anxiety. A sign of life. One of the most common feelings during an existential crisis is anxiety. Your heart races, your mind spins, and you feel lost. But Kierkegaard argued that anxiety is not a curse, it is the dizziness of freedom. When you stand on the edge of endless possibilities, it's natural to feel dizzy. That dizziness is proof that you are free. Imagine standing in front of a blank canvas with every color available. At first, you panic. What if I paint the wrong thing? But that panic is also possibility. It means you can create anything. Psychological perspective. Modern psychology backs this up. Research shows that existential crises often occur at key life transitions. graduating from school, losing, or changing a job, getting married, or divorced, becoming a parent, experiencing illness, losing a loved one, reaching middle age, or retirement. These are moments when old identities collapse and new possibilities appear. Instead of fearing them, psychologists suggest embracing them as thresholds, moments where growth is not only possible, but inevitable. Real-life example. The midlife crisis myth. We often hear about midlife crises, where people buy sports cars, quit jobs, or change partners. Popular culture mocks these actions as signs of immaturity. But in truth, many of these moments are existential awakenings. They reflect the realization that time is limited and that living inauthentically is no longer bearable. For example, John, a 45-year-old engineer, felt trapped in a routine that drained his creativity. He sold his car, left his high-paying job, and became a high school math teacher. His friends thought he was downgrading, but John said for the first time in his life, he felt free. Crisis as death and rebirth. Think of an existential crisis as a kind of symbolic death. The death is the collapse of the false self, the roles you played to please others, the masks you wear to fit in, the shallow definitions of success you've accepted. But after death comes rebirth. Once the false self dies, you are free to construct an authentic life. It is painful, yes, but so is birth. And like birth, it brings something new into the world. Why most people avoid this crisis if existential crises are so transformative? Why do most people run from them? The answer is simple: fear. Fear of disappointing others, fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of freedom itself. As Sartre said, freedom is what you do with what's been done to you. And freedom is scary because it means there are no excuses left. You can no longer say, I had no choice. Real-life example. Steve Jobs and the dropout period. Steve Jobs once described how dropping out of college, with no clear plan, felt terrifying but freeing. During this lost period, he wandered into a calligraphy class. That seemingly random decision shaped the elegant design of Apple products. His crisis, which looked like failure to others, became the soil for innovation. When your world feels like it's collapsing, it's easy to believe that your crisis is nothing but a curse. But what if the collapse is not destruction, but a doorway? What if your existential crisis is not the end of your stability, but the beginning of your freedom? The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre famously said, "Man is condemned to be free." What he meant is that even when you feel trapped, you are always free to choose. Your existential crisis strips away illusions, excuses, and borrowed identities until you are left with this raw truth. You are free to shape your life. Freedom comes with responsibility. Freedom isn't simply about doing whatever you want. It is the responsibility of creating meaning in a world that does not hand it to you. During an existential crisis, when old meanings fall apart, you face the blank canvas of life. This is terrifying because freedom means accountability. You can no longer say, I had no choice. This is just the way life is. Society made me do it. No. Freedom means you are responsible for what you do next. But that responsibility is also where true power lies. Real-life example. Mark's leap into authenticity. Mark had worked as a lawyer for nearly 10 years. He entered law school not out of passion, but because his parents convinced him it was a respectable career. At 32, he experienced a severe existential crisis. He dreaded going to work, felt drained in his relationships, and was haunted by the thought, is this really all there is? After months of anxiety and sleepless nights, Mark made a radical choice. He left his law firm and started a small business focused on environmental sustainability, a cause he genuinely cared about. At first, friends and family called him reckless, but Mark described his decision as the first free choice I had ever made. His crisis became the doorway to his freedom. Why crisis equals freedom? Let's break down why your crisis is secretly a form of liberation. It breaks false identities. You are no longer trapped in roles handed to you by parents, culture, or society. It awakens consciousness. Instead of living on autopilot, you start making conscious decisions. It removes illusions. Wealth, fame, or even relationships stop being unquestioned goals. You begin asking if they are truly meaningful to you. It pushes you toward authenticity. For the first time, you ask, what do I really want? The gift of uncertainty. One of the most uncomfortable parts of an existential crisis is uncertainty. You feel like nothing is stable, nothing is clear. But uncertainty is not a punishment, it is the birthplace of creativity. When everything is certain, nothing new can emerge. But when the old collapses, new paths become possible. Example, think about artists, writers, and innovators. Their greatest works were born during times of uncertainty. Pablo Picasso once said, "Every act of creation is first an act of destruction." In the same way, your existential crisis destroys old certainties so you can create something new. Real-life example, Steve Jobs. Wonder Years. Steve Jobs, after dropping out of college, spent a period in what looked like total confusion. He was broke, sleeping on friends' floors, and without a clear future. But during that uncertain time, he wandered into a calligraphy class that fascinated him. That random choice later influenced Apple's elegant design philosophy. His crisis of uncertainty wasn't wasted time, it was the soil of innovation. Freedom as a choice, not a destination. Many people think freedom is a destination. If they achieve X amount of money, or Y kind of relationship, they will be free. But existential philosophy teaches that freedom is not a destination, it is a moment-to-moment choice. Every time you act authentically, you choose freedom. Every time you betray yourself to please others or hide behind fear, you choose imprisonment. Psychological shifts from victim to creator in psychology. This shift is sometimes described as moving from a victim mindset to a creator mindset. In the victim mindset, you say, "Life is happening to me." In the creator mindset, you say, "I am happening to life." Your existential crisis is the catalyst for this shift. It forces you to stop blaming external circumstances and start living as the author of your own story. Real-life example, from employee to artist. Consider Lisa, a woman who spent 15 years working in a stable but soul-crushing corporate job. At 40, after a divorce and a burnout, she hit an existential crisis. At first, she felt paralyzed, but slowly, she started painting again, something she had loved as a child but abandoned. Within years, she turned her art into a full-time career. Lisa often said, "My divorce and burnout were the best things that happened to me. They set me free." Her pain was the push she needed to reclaim her true self. The power of choice. Small steps toward freedom. Freedom doesn't always mean big dramatic changes. Sometimes, it's in the small choices, saying no when you mean no, speaking honestly instead of pleasing everyone, choosing a hobby that nourishes your soul, even if it's unproductive, spending your weekend on what excites you, not what others expect. These small acts of authenticity accumulate into a life of freedom. Facing the fear of nothingness. One of the biggest fears in an existential crisis is the fear of nothingness. You think, if there is no universal meaning, then what's the point? But this fear can flip into power. If there is no fixed meaning, then you are free to create your own. Meaning is not given, it is made. And in that realization, your crisis becomes your liberation. Example, Albert Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, compared life to the story of Sisyphus, who was condemned to push a boulder up a hill forever. At first, it seems pointless. But Camus said, "We must imagine Sisyphus happy." Why? Because even in the face of absurdity, Sisyphus is free to give his task meaning. Crisis as a threshold, not an end. Think of your crisis as standing at a threshold. Behind you is the old world of illusions. Ahead of you is the open field of freedom. The crisis itself is the doorway. To resist it is to stay stuck. To walk through it is to step into freedom. Real-life example, Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison. By all accounts, this should have been a life-destroying crisis. But Mandela used that time to reflect, learn, and transform himself. When he finally walked free, he did so not as a bitter man, but as a leader ready to reconcile and rebuild his nation. His personal crisis became a doorway not only to his freedom, but to the freedom of millions. The shift in perspective. When you reframe your existential crisis, everything changes. Anxiety becomes curiosity. Emptiness becomes a blank canvas. Fear becomes possibility. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you start asking, "What freedom is this revealing to me?" If part 1 showed us the weight of an existential crisis, and part 2 revealed it as a doorway to freedom, then part 3 is about walking through that doorway. It is not enough to know that crisis leads to freedom. We need to know how to transform that painful chaos into authentic living. The beauty of an existential crisis is that it leaves you standing in front of a blank canvas. The question now is, what do you paint? Step 1. Face the void instead of escaping it. The first and hardest step is to stop running. Most people, when hit by an existential crisis, seek escape through distractions, endless scrolling, binge watching, overworking, drinking, or chasing shallow pleasures. But escape only prolongs the crisis. Instead, you must learn to sit with the void. Allow yourself to feel the emptiness, the discomfort, the uncertainty. It is in the silence of the void that the seeds of authenticity are planted. Real-life example: Viktor Frankl, imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps, lost everything: his family, his freedom, his possessions. Yet he discovered that even in the worst suffering, meaning could be found. He created logotherapy, a method that helps people discover personal meaning in life. Frankl said, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." His crisis didn't destroy him, it transformed him. Step 2. Redefine meaning on your terms. An existential crisis often happens when old meanings collapse. Religion, career, relationships, or culture might have defined your identity before, but now they feel hollow. The mistake many people make is thinking this means there is no meaning at all. The truth is, meaning is not found, it is created. You get to decide what gives your life purpose. Maybe it's raising children with love. Maybe it's building something creative. Maybe it's serving a cause greater than yourself. Maybe it's simply living fully, savoring every day. There is no universal answer, but there must be a personal one. Real-life example: J.K. Rowling hit rock bottom as a single mother on welfare, unemployed and battling depression. Yet in that darkest period, she wrote the first Harry Potter book. What gave her life meaning wasn't external success, but the act of writing a story she deeply cared about. Her crisis became her creative liberation. Step 3. Live authentically instead of performing. One of the biggest traps that an existential crisis exposes is the fact that most of us live as performers, wearing masks, playing roles, meeting expectations. Authentic living means aligning your actions with your values, even if it disappoints others. Ask yourself, am I doing this because I truly want to, or because others expect it? Am I chasing this career, relationship, or lifestyle because it feels authentic or because it looks successful? Authenticity is the foundation of existential freedom. Real-life example: Bronnie Ware, a nurse who spent years caring for dying patients, recorded their greatest regrets. The number one regret of the dying was, "I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me." Authenticity is not luxury, it's survival. Step 4. Use mortality as motivation. One of the main triggers of existential crises is the awareness of death. At first, this feels terrifying, but if embraced, mortality becomes your greatest ally. Knowing that life is finite forces you to prioritize what truly matters. Instead of being paralyzed by the fact that time is short, let it energize you. Each day becomes an opportunity. Each moment becomes precious. Real-life example: Steve Jobs, in his famous Stanford speech, said, "Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life." He saw death not as an enemy, but as a compass. It reminded him not to waste time living someone else's life. Step 5. Choose creation over escape. When you're in crisis, the temptation to escape is huge, but the real path to freedom is creation. Instead of running from your void, use it as raw material. Write, paint, build, teach, start a new project. Creation doesn't have to be grand. Even cooking a meal with love, or building a small garden, is an act of reclaiming meaning. Real-life example: Maya Angelou, one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, went through periods of silence and trauma. Instead of letting her suffering consume her, she turned it into poetry and art that continues to inspire millions. Her crisis became her creation. Step 6. Small acts of freedom. Every day, freedom is not just in grand decisions like quitting your job or moving to another country. It is in the small, everyday acts of authenticity. Say no when you mean no. Spend time on what nourishes your soul. Choose honesty over comfort. Build rituals that reflect your values. These small choices add up. Over time, they create a life of integrity. Example: a man named Kevin, who had been stuck in corporate life, started by setting aside just 30 minutes a day for writing a passion he had ignored. Within 2 years, he had written a novel. Freedom began not with quitting his job, but with a daily commitment to authenticity. Step 7. Find community. But stay independent. Freedom does not mean isolation. Humans are social beings, and sharing your journey with others gives strength. However, community should not become another cage. The key is to find connections that support your authenticity, not demand conformity. Real-life example: the existentialist cafes of 20th century Paris were communities where philosophers like Sartre, de Beauvoir, and chemists debated freely. They found connection, but none gave up their independence. Their friendships were not cages, they were springboards. Step 8. Accept the ongoing nature of crisis. Here's the final truth. Existential crises don't just happen once. They return at different points in life. Each one strips away a new layer of illusion and opens a deeper level of freedom.